My name is Vasil Aliniak, and I have a story to tell you about industrial unions and workers in Canada for almost 100 years since Confederation. Our lives were forever transformed by factories, which grew and spread because the railway linked distant communities and opened markets. At first, craft unions flourished. They resisted employers' efforts to destroy apprenticeships and control the labor process. New types of skilled workers, like machinists and locomotive engineers, eagerly formed unions. But they put up walls around each trade to keep out competitors, and the great majority of workers were still excluded from the modest gains achieved by skilled working men. This set the stage for the Great Upheaval. In the 1880s, politicized workers became interested in an aggressive new unionism to improve conditions for all workers. Socialists in British coal mining towns created all-in unions for the first time. Life in tight-knit industrial towns or neighborhoods encouraged a sense of solidarity and community-wide unionism. The Knights of Labor were one of the first unions to organize the unskilled and include women and black workers. They promoted the ideal of the honest working man. Established in the United States, the Knights quickly spread through Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, forming almost 450 local assemblies. Their success so concerned the government, it was one reason for appointing the Royal Commission on the Relations of Labor and Capital in 1886. The new unions faced many obstacles. First, craft unions expelled their own members if they also joined an industrial union. Secondly, employers could easily fire employees suspected of organizing a union. And of course, governments and courts frequently intervened in labor conflicts on behalf of employers to protect the so-called industrial peace. Even the Industrial Disputes and Investigation Act of 1907 did little to redress the power imbalance between unions and employers. Nevertheless, early industrial unions were able to extract some concessions. Unionized coal miners, for example, forced employers and the state to make their occupation less murderous. Many workers also joined or supported socialist or labor parties, which were increasingly successful in electing their own candidates. Still, others doubted meaningful reform could be achieved through the ballot box and turned instead to ideas of revolution. The industrial workers of the world aimed to unify all workers into one union to overthrow the capitalist system. The Wobblies, as they were called, rapidly gained support in Western Canada. Fearful of the IWW's commitment to free speech and direct action, employers and the government recruited labor spies and vigilantes, and would arrest or simply murder Wobblies. When the Great War erupted, many workers made a bloody sacrifice on Europe's battlefields. Joining the military meant, among other things, earning a steady wage. Failing to entice enough recruits, the government conscripted more. Conscription angered many workers. They resented wartime profiteering and their bosses' unwillingness to recognize unions. Prices rose faster than wages. More than 400 strikes erupted in 1919, prompting a worried government to establish another inquiry, the Royal Commission on Industrial Relations. The Winnipeg General Strike and sympathy strikes like it symbolized this great labor revolt. Delegates at the Western Labor Conference in Calgary formed the One Big Union and sent fraternal greetings to comrades in the newly formed Soviet Union. The 1920s did not roar for working-class families. Many were unemployed and at least half were poor, struggling constantly for food, shelter, and clothing. It was a period of retreat for organized labor. Most employers took advantage of the downturn to fire troublemakers, roll back wages, and install company unions. A minority of large companies implemented welfare schemes and joint labor management councils to co-opt workers and secure workplace harmony. By 1929, untrammeled capitalism led to a spectacular market crash. A decade of depression ensued. About 1 million Canadians were unemployed, or 1 in 4 workers. Many left home to scavenge, and single men were sent to work camps. unemployed workers organized the On to Ottawa trek starting in Vancouver that the RCMP violently disbanded in Regina. Poverty and despair increased the appeal of radical politics, and workers embraced new political parties. The Communists organized the unemployed and families on relief. The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation would eventually form the first socialist government in North America when Tony Douglas became Premier of Saskatchewan. The sit-down strikes of U.S. auto workers and early successes of the newly formed Congress of Industrial Organizations inspired industrial workers in Canada. When General Motors sped up production in Oshawa and refused to recognize union representatives, more than 4,000 workers walked out. The strike was won in 15 days, marking a coming of age of industrial unionism in Canada. The 1935 Wagner Act, part of the New Deal in the United States, compelled private sector employers for the first time to bargain with union representatives. Some Canadian provinces followed suit, including Alberta in 1938. But it was not until 1944, when the federal government declared Privy Council Order No. 1003, that a new regime of compulsory collective bargaining began to affect all of Canada. The government was trying to maintain wartime production, because full employment had encouraged Canadian workers to strike in unprecedented numbers. The system of modern industrial relations was cemented by strikes after the war, like Fort Windsor, which led to what is called the Rand Formula. The labor movement accepted a major trade-off, giving up on workplace militancy and attempts to control production to instead pursue gradual increases in purchasing power. This was the post-war compromise, and in the golden years that followed, social programs of the welfare state provided security. Negotiated wage increases and benefits improved the standard of living for many Canadians, especially for members of industrial unions. But unions were expected to behave responsibly, and were legally required to police their own members. During the Cold War, the struggle against the Soviet Union became the pretext for unions to purge progressive thinkers, and for governments to enact restrictive anti-union legislation. For labor, the future looked uncertain.
Hi there, my name is Chantel Turgeon, and I have a story to tell you about how government employees came to think of themselves as workers and surged to the forefront of Canadian labor. In the first half of the 20th century, Parliament and provincial legislatures grudgingly supported collective bargaining between workers and private sector employers. The public sector was considered different. Government employees saw themselves as civil servants and had no say in their working conditions. The few jobs governments created were doled out to individuals with connections to elected officials. A change of government meant wholesale firings of civil servants. In 1885, Manitoba was the first province to legislate a Civil Service Act and made it clear that any request for a raise shall be considered as a tendering of the resignation. The view that public sector workers were servants persisted for decades. As late as 1964, Quebec's premier proclaimed, "The Queen does not negotiate with her subjects." Post offices were among the earliest public services to organize. The wages of letter carriers failed to keep up with rising costs of living. They were not awarded even a single salary increase for 30 years. The Railway Mail Clerks Association formed in 1889, a union of letter carriers formed 2 years later, and of postal clerks in 1911, but they were lobby groups rather than recognized collective bargaining agents. During the turbulent years around World War I, civil servants faced high inflation and followed the lead of private sector workers who established unions. Firefighters in Edmonton, for example, organized and won a collective agreement. Teachers at this time were angry that school boards decided unilaterally to dock pay for the war effort. By 1921, 2/3 of Alberta's teachers had joined the ATA, and there had been a major strike of Edmonton teachers. Governments were typically intolerant of strikes and reacted harshly, especially against those it considered instigators. In 1924, a national strike of postal workers was broken by wholesale dismissals. Police who struck in Quebec and in Toronto met the same fate. Such firings set an example and helped discipline the remaining workers. government managed to suppress attempts of public workers to organize, in part because the civil service remained small right up until World War II, when barely 8% of the Canadian workforce was employed in education, health, or government service. Divisions among public employees also contributed to the problem. For example, efforts by a union to organize all federal workers met resistance from white-collar workers who regarded themselves as a cut above the blue-collar. The large number of classifications in the federal civil service encouraged competition that obstructed efforts to create unions. Changing conditions in the post-war years eventually helped unions make major breakthroughs in the public sector. The example of industrial unions was contagious, and public employees envied the new rights and steady increases in purchasing power won by many workers. The public sector began to grow rapidly, both in size and complexity, and more workers were required to deliver the new programs of the welfare state. Hospitals, schools, and suburbs grew in step with Canada's population and affluence. Most new union members from the mid-1960s forward were civil servants, municipal employees, healthcare workers, teachers, and others. Many worked in occupations that had no private sector counterparts, like air traffic controllers and lighthouse keepers. Steady growth in government employment meant that by the end of the 1960s, 1 in 5 workers was a public employee. In the decade after it was founded in 1963, the Canadian Union of Public Employees doubled its membership and passed the United Steelworkers to become Canada's largest union. It was a sort of industrial-style union of the public sector. The face of organized labor was changing quickly. Public sector unions like CUPE gained hundreds of thousands of female members, reflecting the rapid growth of paid employment for married women. The 1960s were a remarkable time of new militancy, especially in Quebec, where the Quiet Revolution was underway. Students and feminists protested, and a new generation of workers led hundreds of defiant wildcat strikes from 1964 to 66. Rank-and-file union members angrily challenged the deal of the post-war settlement, surprising not only employers and government, but also union officials. For public employees, the illegal National Postal Strike in 1965 was decisive. By 1967, the Public Service Staff Relations Act became law, giving federal employees the right to choose between compulsory arbitration, mediation,